Hey, this is Jared Chamberlain with Alex Weston, our partner. With the Chamberlain Group, you can find us at chamberlaingroup.ca, and this is what we call our little Chamberlain chat. Today we're talking about RPRs. We're talking about real property reports. What does it mean for buyers and what does it mean for sellers? So Alex, why don't you explain to our audience what a real property report is? What does it mean?
To our vast audience, an RPR is essentially a legal document that displays any significant improvements made to a property. The improvements need to be permanent improvements, so temporary things like a swing set for kids would not count. But things that do count would be the house, garage, deck, fence, patio. Those kind of things are displayed on an RPR. Basically, it's an aerial survey of the property.
Yeah, totally. So for a buyer, when is it expected to get an RPR? Because I know there can be some confusion when you're get a townhouse or an apartment condo or a house or even acreage, that kind of thing. When is it typically expected you'd get an RPR?
Typically, depending on your purchase, if it's a house, any time that you own the land, that would be a time that you would want to see an RPR. Typically, the contracts that we use in Calgary, the real estate contracts provided by area, contain a clause where the seller is required to provide the buyer with an RPR with enough time for the buyer to review it and go from there if they need to make any changes or do any changes to that RPR.
And here's actually a little tip. When you're making the offer with the buyer, sometimes it's good to put in the contract saying that you actually want to see any current or the new or the past, whatever RPR they have, as a condition or within 24 hours or whatever it may be. Because it's good to see if it needs updating, and you can help that process along if the selling agent or the seller hasn't been proactive in that. And so in speaking to that too, the selling side, when it's expected, again, if you own the land is the big thing. So if you've made changes like Alex was saying to your garage, to fences, any permanent structures, if it's a permanent shed or a movable shed, those things can all make a difference. If it's movable, you don't need it. Obviously, you can move it. So the big thing with that is it can take sometimes 4 to 6 weeks to have a turnaround on an RPR. So as a seller, you want to make sure that you have enough time to do that, ideally before you list, if not even into your actual when you are listed, but for sure before possession date, because we want to give that RPR to the lawyers at the closing so the buyers can review it at the absolute latest is the idea with that. So how does an RPR typically protect you? What are some of the things that it protects the buyer during that transaction?
Yeah, one of the big things when you're buying a property is you don't really know the boundaries of the property just by looking. So, for instance, if a seller had recently put up a fence, you don't know if that fence is actually on the property line or if it's on the seller's property or the neighbor's property. Garage, for instance, could be built partly, if it's backing onto an alley, could be built partly onto the city's property, which the city, as we all know, is never forgiving about things like that. So we want to make sure that we're protecting ourselves from any future legal action or significant cost to either tear down and remove something or get an easement put in place to make sure that particular fixture can stay where it is.
And on RPR too, it'll also show you utility right-of-ways. It'll show you if the city you can't build anything on a certain spot of your land because they may have to come in and dig it up. So if there's trees, if there's shrubs, if there's whatever, the city could come and actually just dig all that stuff right up without compensating you.
Yeah.
I mean, they'll usually work with you to do it, but that's the idea with it. So in saying that, there's sometimes one thing I want to bring up that isn't talked about a lot is when you're buying a bank-owned or a foreclosure or different types of properties that way, do they typically provide RPRs for you if it is a property that needs an RPR?
They don't. Typically, when you're buying a bank sale or a judicial sale, they waive any warranties on their side, and one of those warranties would be to provide you an RPR.
As is, kind of.
Yeah, exactly. So you're buying the property as is, and it's up to you then to get your own RPR done, just to protect yourself.
Totally. So a lot of the times, a typical cost that you can kind of see in an RPR, if you have to get a brand new one as a seller, it can cost you anywhere from, let's call it $600 to $800, and you're paying for a compliance stamp on top of that. And that's where the city reviews the survey plan, make sure everything's compliant, make sure everything is within the boundaries, the right size, the right heights for decks, all that kind of stuff through the bylaws. And that's usually I think it's roughly about a $200 fee for that. So you could be looking at about $800 to $1,000 to get a brand new RPR. If you're updating an old RPR, you go back to the existing survey company, and from there, they will actually take your file number, come out, update their document, take it to the city, and that's not a lot cheaper, but it can be $400 to $600 for them to update it, and then you have a compliance stamp on top of that. So that kind of wraps up for the general outline and ideas of an RPR. If you have any questions or need anything from us, you can find us at chamberlaingroup.ca. That's it for our Chamberlain chat today. Have a great week.
Bye-bye. I don't know. Was that good?